Namaste, everyone. Welcome to today's guest talk. The topic today is His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Art of Happiness. We are happy to have Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra as our guest speaker today. Many of us would already be knowing about him. I would share a formal introduction for him. Rajiv Mehrotra is a scholar, prolific writer, and a highly decorated director and producer of documentary films. Educated at St. Stephen's College, New Delhi, and the universities of Oxford and Columbia, Rajiv Mehrotra has had a multifaceted career. He has directed, produced more than 650 documentary films, winning more than 300 awards, including 49 national awards from the President of India. His 9 books, published in more than 50 editions and languages, include The Essential Dalai Lama, The Dalai Lama on Life, Living and Happiness, The Mind of the Guru, and Thakur Sri Ramakrishna, a biography. He is a disciple of the Dalai Lama and serves as the secretary and trustee of the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, established with the Nobel Peace Prize.
That's it. Now I'm blushing. Let's get on with the program.
Welcome, Rajiv. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are really delighted and honored to have you with us. Looking forward to a lovely session with you.
Well, thank you very much, Arunima ji, and of course, most of all, Ramesh Bhai, who I've had the privilege of knowing for many decades as a truly enlightened human being who manifests in his modest simplicity and tenacity, reaching out into the planet and into the community to do good work, and which really is the ultimate expression and manifestation of goodness and divinity. If that's how you, if you understand the notion of divinity in that manner. So thank you, Ramesh ji. This has been a wonderful privilege to connect with you. And I have to say that I'm somewhat bewildered today, and I should just share with you that half an hour ago, I got a call from my wife that our household help, who had looked after my father in his last years, lost his 18-month son. And so she's at the hospital. And I said I would join her. And then she said, "What are you going to be doing?" I said, "Well, I'm going to be talking about the art of happiness." And that seemed a very sort of incongruous reflection at this extremely challenging time, but my mind was racing, and it just sort of, and I began to focus a lot more on the teachings of the Dalai Lama and how they manifest the teachings of the Buddha himself. He is considered an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara. And so I thought perhaps I would reflect for a few moments on the Dalai Lama himself before I sort of plunge into trying to make sense of what happened half an hour ago and then share my sort of unfolding reflections with you. And I think that we see the Dalai Lama, who has been living as a guest of the government of India for more than 60 years, who was exiled from Tibet by the Chinese genocide there. He saw millions of his fellow countrymen and millions of his fellow travelers in the path of Buddhism killed, monasteries destroyed, and living in exile in India at the whims of a foreign government, and with this huge responsibility, and taken away from his mother and family when he was just a young boy, and he lost a country, and yet he manages to radiate so much joy and happiness, really. And I began to reflect on what he would feel, and in my own experience with him, when my mother was dying, and I was quite devastated, and I went to see him, and I thought it was rather harsh, but he said, meditate on death. And while I went to another well-known teacher on whom I was making film, and I mean, this is not to sort of undermine anybody, but that teacher said to me, well, here is some vibhuti, go and mix it in water and give it to your mother, and she will be well. And so there were these two sort of contrasting approaches that somehow, the imperative we feel that all will be well, whatever well is. And I sort of cut in a sense to the Buddha himself as he stepped out of the palace and saw old age, suffering, sickness, and death, and a mendicant as a possible means of engaging in finding a way out of suffering. And we have somehow began to assume that that this would lead to happiness, whatever that state might be. And perhaps that is a corruption of our times, sort of manifest and promoted by its being enshrined in the United States Constitution as a legitimate aspiration, without really an effort at defining what that happiness might really be, and what constitutes the happiness that we talk about. Because I mean, His Holiness has done a book called The Art of Happiness, and he says that the function and the purpose of human beings to be in human form is the pursuit of happiness. And I think that this is a semantic issue, really, as to what is happiness. And I think he would conclude that when you are deeply happy, you're not really happy, and it inherently becomes transitory. We either want to freeze the moment through a cell phone image, or our sort of our fantasies, the promotion of what we see as happiness on television, and when we suffer, we want that suffering to end. So perhaps we are truly happy only when we experience or are not conscious of the fact that we are suffering or that we are happy. And the closest English word, I suppose, that would come to that might be equanimity, but I'm not so sure. And so I would just sort of go, down, the Buddha's journey, which in many ways is paralleled by His Holiness 2,500 years later. And so the Buddha steps out and he engages from the palace into the forest, and he engages in the techniques and practices that were available at that time to see if he could find a solution. I'm not sure he was looking for an answer per se as to how we could not suffer. But I don't think that he imagined that he could somehow stop the physiological pain of old age and sickness and death. I think what he was looking for was a way that we could assimilate. I hate to use the word come to terms, because that's a sort of kind of a reluctant acceptance rather than a affirmative embracing, which is what I think that the Buddha finally achieved under the Bodhi tree. And what was important is that as he sat under the Bodhi tree and he just said, I'm not going to give up till I find an answer or a solution. And solution was not really the elimination, as I said, of the physical elements of suffering or the inevitability of what unfolds in life. Birth, old age, sickness, and death, and all the other terrible things that happen, or climate change that we are now confronting, and war, and sort of deep intolerance and hatred. It really was to be able to recognize the true nature of reality. And what was important in the Buddha's experience was that this realization was a realization. It was not a verbalized revelation from the divine, something external to him. It was a deep understanding that was transformative. So I prefer to use the word realization because you move from intellectual understanding perhaps to experience. And it is only when you deeply realize that it begins to impact your deepest reflexive responses. So you don't have to keep reminding yourself or tutoring yourself to behave in a particular manner. You experience the transforming realization of the true nature of reality, and hence embracing it, that you then begin to be in the flow or in the unfolding present of embracing and celebrating whatever happens and whatever unfolds in your life and in the lives of others. It is not easy to achieve. It is much easier to cerebrally talk about it, or have me sit here and talk about it. And I think the genius of the Buddha, and I will come to the techniques that His Holiness recommends, was that when he stepped out of the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya, he just wondered what on earth he should do, because what he had experienced was a non-conceptual, non-verbalized insight, and which it'd be impossible or impractical for him to share. And my favorite example is that if you haven't tasted coffee, there's no way I can tell you what coffee tastes like. And so what we now describe, whatever enlightenment is, but that all-encompassing wisdom, knowing, we can struggle with our language to try and give it a label that will sort of persuade someone else to sort of recognize what I am getting at. And so we have each evolved our own sort of theories and definitions limited by vocabulary to what enlightenment might be. And so he then felt that he needed to share the conceptual framework as best was possible, but most importantly, the method, some of the techniques that he had used. And so the genius of the Buddha was the juxtaposition in fairly simple terms of method and wisdom. That neither of them individually or singularly would have the kind of transformative experience of realization that we are talking about. And I think the great attraction for me, certainly it's been some time since I read Sri Aurobindo, and I think that was Sri Aurobindo's quest too. That, he looked at its intellectual articulation and verbalization, using a whole variety of techniques and approaches, from music to drama to what have you, and but equally it was his sadhana to look at what were the methodologies that he could recommend, and surely there isn't a single set of methodologies to experience and realize whatever this might be. And it remains extremely important that we don't get stuck with our particular verbalized labels of it, and that perhaps is the the underlying reason why we experience so much intolerance and conflict, because our conceptual frameworks don't match, and they cannot match. And I'm not suggesting that ultimate reality is somehow a single one. And with the old example of the blind men around an elephant, and that we are each looking at facets of it. I think what the Dalai Lama and the Buddha are certainly saying, and which now seems to be a perspective of modern science, that the very nature of reality is perceived and experienced differently. And we, so far, though we have unified theories, we have theories that we're told by chaos theory and quantum theory, for example, that the micro universe is reflected in the macro universe. Now, that's a theory. We are also told that the very nature of reality is impacted by the presence of the observer. And so you have the famous split experiment, the light going through, two small holes, and the shapes and forms that it takes. So there was a very fundamental recognition that this was a particular path and a structure of practice and method and wisdom, and that it was not definitive and final for all sentient beings, which is what a phrase that the Dalai Lama often uses. And so, I won't dwell too much on the Buddha's teachings itself, but really to talk about how the Dalai Lama, as its perhaps best known representative for our times, and is perhaps one of the preeminent leaders across faiths. And he would argue that Buddhism is really not a faith, because he often quotes the Buddha, who on his deathbed was asked by Ananda, who had been looking after him, who was mourning his passing and saying, "Now what are we going to do? And I still have questions to ask." And to which he said, "Well, of course, you have my teachings, which you can refer to, but all my teachings must stand up to the scrutiny of reason and logic and your lived experience. So they are not finite and they're not definitive," which is why certainly the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and many other Buddhist approaches to the Buddhist teaching. Of course, you have the Mahayana and the Hinayana, and I don't want to go into that at all, but merely to suggest that Buddhism remained dynamic in that it was assimilated in different social and cultural contexts around the world. In a sense, Hinduism was more effective in assimilating, but it was Buddhism that was assimilated and responded as it assimilated itself into itself, the beliefs and teachings and practices of the communities that adopted it. And that has remained its strength, and that over the years from Nagarjuna to, a whole range of Buddhist teachers have come, and many of them are believed to be Buddhas themselves, who have taken further the teachings of the Buddha. And so it isn't frozen in what the Buddha said. And this is one of the few traditions where there isn't an original voice, that is the original voice of a revelation received, that is frozen and now needs to be interpreted or verified for its authenticity. It has allowed itself the space to continue to evolve and to be continually interpreted and adapted to unfolding realities. So what was this nature of reality? And so His Holiness argues, as the Buddha does, that if we can truly understand what it is, and I keep repeating this, intellectually and experientially, then we will reach this stage of, for want of a better word, equanimity, but for all practical purposes, I guess, in common contemporary jargon, happiness. I can offer you a long critique of happiness and its linkages to materialism, its transitoriness, etc. But time and questions permitting, we'll explore that route. And so he broke it up into some elements, and which now form the basis of His Holiness's Buddhist, and I should add and underscore in bold letters his secular teachings, because there is now a movement, certainly in the West, that describes itself as Buddhism without beliefs, that describes itself as secular Buddhism. Now, that may not necessarily, there's considerable debate around this, whether that is still Buddhism or not. But in my own experience, I've seen in countries as distant as Costa Rica, where I was invited to address a church congregation, to address what was a Buddhist congregation in a church, which had a very large number of Christians. And so at the end of it, I said, well, what are you doing here? And they would respond, well, while being true to our faith, there is so much that we can learn from the teachings of the Buddha and the techniques and practices, some of which I will try and share with you. So it was that this one of the pivots is the idea of course, impermanence, that nothing is permanent, everything changes. And this is not merely a response to the death of an 18-month-old child. And I just, I'm stunned as to, what I will say to him when I see him in an hour's time, and what words I can use at this stage. And so I will first flag these ideas and then try and develop them a little further. And so it's impermanence, and that links to the idea of interdependence, and which means that we are interdependent on each other, and certainly with the global climate change that we see now, and we know from scientific theory, very famous quantum theory, that when a butterfly flaps its wings in the rainforests of the Amazon, there can be a tornado in Bangladesh. And there isn't the time and space here to look at what that causality is. So very much in the nature of modern ideas of causality, you have interdependence. So and our own lives are interdependent. The fact that I'm sitting here and speaking to you is dependent on so many factors. Electricity that is powering my computer, the person who designed and made the computer, the cup of tea that I had, the person who, the guy who's growing the tea, who cut the tea leaves, the household help who made it for me. I put some milk, and the milk came from somewhere else. So even our most mundane activities and so what we consume every day is dependent on so many different people. And so when we recognize our interdependence and our impermanence, it breeds. It's not something that we superimpose on it. It breeds a sense of gratitude, because we couldn't survive if it wasn't for this support and the interlinkages that make our lives and the survival of the planet possible, as it will its destruction if we don't get our act together on climate change in time. And so it's as a sort of the antidote to this, and simultaneously something that we can consciously nurture is the idea of compassion. And so what we can do, and what I will try and do with the suffering family, is to be compassionate and feel with them. I don't think that words or rhetoric, drawing from the scriptures or the cliches, are actually make an impact. So it would really be to the degree that I can be present and experience both my sense of interdependence, gratitude, connection, while embracing or helping him embrace the idea of impermanence. And so, what the journey does is that first His Holiness will talk about interdependence, and I'm just giving you a brief snapshot. It's quite self-evident, and the same thing about impermanence. And this might be a time for a minor diversion into the idea of happiness. And I think that I mean, I don't want to look at causes. I don't know what any sort of a particular aspect that has caused this obsession with permanence. Whether it is our economic system, it is advertising, it is Bollywood movies, Hollywood movies, media. I mean, there are all kinds of fingers pointed at different facets. I have no idea, if we can really isolate any specific element, but just a composite of who we have become as a species. And I do feel that we are in a state of crisis as a species. And so what happens is that we are so ignorant of the idea of impermanence that we believe that every romantic relationship is eternal. If you're lucky, it may last this lifetime, or the lifetime of one of you, and or that the new car that we buy, or the clock, or the mobile phones are the new thing that we keep upgrading, and even as we see them being impermanent, we quickly put them aside. And I think we've begun to do that with our relationships. That rather than embracing and engaging and evolving with that impermanence, we just put it aside and replace it. And so we replace our human relationships just as we replace our telephones and our motor cars, or our jobs, or our commitments, or our political beliefs, or our ideologies. If we were to recognize that they're all inherently impermanent, maybe there will be a quality of softness in our relationship to them, and less disruptive when change occurs. And I think those of you who have read the biographies of the great masters will see, from Aurobindo to Ramakrishna to in more recent times, Gandhiji, Ramana Maharishi barely managed to sort of hold back his grieving at the loss of his mother. And so when people have lost, great men and women have lost their partners or parents, they have been able to process this to varying degrees. Nobody has been indifferent to it. And so nobody is making a case that we can embrace impermanence with the profundity and depth that would suggest that we can be indifferent to it and purely look at it as impersonal causality. No, this has happened and so be it. Because simultaneous to that is the element of interdependence. So we are not just mechanistic human beings. We have sensibilities, we have emotions. Our very survival depends often on the compassion and generosity of others. I've seen it with our help who lost his young son, as to how he enabled the last 5 years of my father's life to be far more productive and meaningful. So we just see these layer upon layer of gratitude, interdependence, the nature of our survival, even as it poses with the final realization of impermanence. So that really is the core teaching of this, and so the thing that we can most easily and logically understand and structure and practice that will help us process the realities of interdependence, and impermanence, and is compassion. And so what is compassion? So these are all sort of complicated English words that don't have literal equivalents. So we just say compassion as a moving away from the notion of love, attachment, to a more broadly embracing awareness of interdependence and gratitude. And we cultivate compassion by breaking it up into these elements. So if I am, this is our household help, the name is Arjun. So if I feel his pain, I am able to feel his pain because we have been dependent on him. We share we share the human condition. We share this planet, and that I too know that it may not be the loss of an 18-month boy, but that I have and I will undergo similar experiences in my own life. And so in a sense that he is connected to me in significant and profound ways. And if you come from a tradition, for example, that believes in reincarnation, it will tell you that every one of us on the screen, and including Arjun and everybody in my life, has at some point been a mother, father, brother, or sister, over lifetimes. And, just like I might feel a devotion and attachment to my late father, just because he's not in physical form, it doesn't mean that that affection is diminished, or that if we all live to be 200 years or 500 or 1,000 years, that I will suddenly forget that dimension. And what compassion then does is that it softens the sense of ourselves, because we have an exaggerated sense, and there's plenty in Sri Aurobindo about this. So when they do psychological testing now in laboratories and universities around the world, they find that people who have mental problems or confront crises that overwhelm them, in their narratives, there is an overwhelming use of the words I, me, mine. And which is sort of in a sense antithetical to the larger reality that I've just been talking about. And so if we can begin to soften that sense of the self by beginning to think of other people, like Ramesh Bhai has spent most of his life doing, you immediately, your own sense of your own pain and suffering diminishes. And this is not just theory, but I think there has been volumes and volumes of analysis and testing. So they found that people who are engaged in the practice of meditation, and I will briefly flag what meditation is, where I just said about 10 minutes, they find that as is I, me, mine, and the obsession with that diminishes, they reach greater levels of equanimity. So, His Holiness often argues that we spend so much time in training ourselves for our careers, as to how we look, the clothes we wear, amongst the many wonderful things that I learned from Ramesh Bhai. If you just wear a kurta pajama, I mean, when I could afford to, I went to Fab India. Life is much easier, I don't have to worry about whether my clothes are in fashion or they match or they don't match. So, right from that, from the everyday living aspect to the more, how do I put it, the deeper cravings that if we can do those, practice those tangibly, that this sense of the self, that, how do I look? What will people think of me? Because I look this way. So as that sense of the I softens, and you begin to think of other people, the very act of nurturing that. So Zolas argues that because we spend so much time in training to be for our professions, to how we look, to how we can excel. I mean, there's a big 1,000-hour Rubicon that they talk about if you want to be a maestro musician or you want to be a sports person, there is this 1,000 hours that you invest. But we don't find that 1,000 hours to invest in training our minds, and which is actually what processes all these experiences and achievements. So here we have a man, 88 years old, but certainly till about 6-7 years ago, he was receiving training and continued receiving training and instruction from lamas who were half his age and much younger than himself. So that journey of training the mind never ceases. So it isn't that you have a peak experience and you have become a teacher or a master or a godman, and that this is it. You now have it all. So that journey has been an ongoing, continuous one, and he still practices 5 or 6 hours a day in order to continue training. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. This isn't what just applies to the Dalai Lama. I was also a student of the yoga teacher B.K. Iyengar, an iconic figure who was teaching in Pune. And I went to see him about 3 or 4 months before he died. And he was in this very convoluted yoga asana. And I said, Guruji, what are you doing? I mean, you have all these problems and your age. He said, there are still parts of my body that my consciousness has not reached. So that tenacity of pegging away, of being able to experience the true nature of, I have to say relative reality, but reality from the point of that you approach this. And we also know today that as brain imaging has progressed, the idea of neuroplasticity of the brain, which means that as you practice and you cultivate through practice different mental states, that it begins to impact the biochemistry of your brain in enduring ways. So change is possible even at the biological cellular level, and it's too complicated to get into the relationship between brain, mind, body, soul, is there a soul, et cetera, but purely in the causality aspects, we do know that if you take a pill, say an antidepressant, whether you should or not, whether it works or not is another debate, but that it can impact your emotions. And similarly, through the practice of meditation. And what do we understand as the practice of meditation? Is training the mind, familiarizing the mind consciously with ideas and thoughts, such as compassion, interdependence, and impermanence, that it begins to affect your reflexive responses. And it's not very different that if I wanted to lose 10 kilos of weight and Rameshji decided he wanted to build up muscles, we would have to do some form of exercise if we wanted change in that sense. And so we have to exercise our brain. And this is too short a space, and I think certainly the Aurobindo tradition offers a rich heritage, an inheritance from the great master and the mother of practices. And again, it is His Holiness's deep commitment to celebrating diversity that celebrates and recognizes that depending on our mental dispositions and where we are geographically located, where we are climatically located, where we are culturally located, that each of us needs a different mental diet, just as we need a different physical diet. And that we can learn from each other. And so, His Holiness will go into a church and sing a Christian hymn. He will go into a mosque and wear a skull cap and do the namaz. And to the degree, in terms of his openness to experience, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Dargah in Ajmer, which is very famous and well known. And so, Khwaja Sahib had founded this centuries ago. So it's a Sufi shrine, and Salman Chishti is the young keeper of the faith there. And he was telling me, I mean, I was there, but on the periphery, that His Holiness went to visit the Ajmer Dargah. And he prostrated before the grave of Khwaja Sahib, and his head was resting on the perimeter. And everybody got worried. I mean, it was about 20, 25 minutes. He was just prostrate flat with his head resting on it. And then he rose and sort of in deep silence and glow and said, I have experienced divinity. So someone asked him and said, well, I mean, you're an agnostic. And how have you experienced divinity? He said, well, I have experienced what people feel divinity is like. And I have great respect for that experience. And I think that it teaches us many things. It really teaches us that the imperative in our own journey and quest, that while we can draw inspiration and guidance to the teachings and experiences of the great masters, ultimately our journey is our own. And even though it's a huge cliche, but I think it's real in every syllable and every word, that the destination is the journey, because we create this fantastic aspiration for ourselves that when I am perfect, either have all my possessions, or I have spiritual materialism in the sense that I am now enlightened and I can now tell the world how to live their lives. And so one of the most endearing aspects for me about my guru and teacher is the number of times he will say, I don't know. So as someone who knows very little, and it's sort of time up for me, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions from little that I know. I'm not sure how you want to structure this, but I sort of hand this over to Arunima.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a lovely session, very insightful. Participants, if anyone has a question, please put the question in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself, raise the hand, and please unmute.
Okay, there are two questions which I'll take up. And it says, why did you join as a devotee of the Dalai Lama when Swami Raghunathanand, your spiritual guru, was still alive? Very simple. I think that there is a great people don't know enough about the Ramakrishna movement and Swami Raghunathananda himself. What was truly amazing, I wrote a biography of Sri Ramakrishna. And so here was a avatar the people believed was the incarnation of the divine. And he became priest in the temple set up by a lower caste queen. And what does he do? Once he takes charge, he engages in the sadhanas and practices of the different strands and schools of Indian philosophy and practice, Advaita, even Tantra with Bhairavi. And he doesn't stop there. Mind you, all this is in public view. And so he is sending out a very powerful message. And then he sets up a kutir, a little cottage, on the precincts of the near the temple, and he engages in the practices of Islam. He even eats beef. And when I did my biography, the only thing that the Swamiji asked me, he said, don't say beef, it'll just stir things up. Just say, ate the diet of a Muslim. Let people come to their own conclusions. And so that's why we left it. And he then went on, and the practices of, the Christian tradition of, so it was that fundamentally inclusive. And what is not known is that Swami Vivekananda, of course, was committed to the Vedanta. And the principal devotee of Bhakta, Ramakrishna believed in Bhakti, was a Vedantist who was Swami Vivekananda. And also not widely known that Vivekananda said that the Buddha is my Ishta and Ramakrishna is my master. So if you go around the Ramakrishna mission, which is basically a Vedantic institution, while it honors in a very sacred part of it, there is always worship of Ramakrishna. He went into deep meditation as to what kind of institution and structure he should organize for his master. And the Ramakrishna mission is based on the model of the Buddhist Sangha. They elect their president. They are democratic. They are decentralized. And they are basically secular. So when I was engaging with Swami Ranganathananda, from whom I received Diksha while still in my teens, and I know our conversations used to often veer towards Buddhism. And he felt that my journey really lay with Buddhism. And so it was Buddhism under the sort of the tutelage of Swami Ranganathananda. And I met His Holiness, and I came and told Swamiji that I had. And the great joy of my life was that, very rare, that my first guru and my second guru became really good friends. And His Holiness visited Belur, Ranganathanandaji went to Dharamsala, and it was just amazing. And I think this is a lesson, this relationship and my own journey for our times. I mean, that's how this happened. And I wish that kind of cross-fertilization or engagement would happen today. We will be such a happier community and civilization and people. And then another question was, can you speak about the practice of Tonglen, sending and receiving? Now, Tonglen is a difficult practice. And well, what is Tonglen? Tonglen basically is a practice where to engage in the practice, you sit down, you do alternative nostril breathing, or you concentrate on your breathing, or whatever practice, or body scans and things like that, whatever will help you settle your mind down, relatively speaking. And then you experience great compassion, which you visualize. You visualize your mother, and you experience the warmth and love of your mother, or her particular fragrance. The problem, of course, is that when we've been trying to share this in Western countries, many of them have neurotic relationships with their parents. And so we had to find a substitute. So we can say it can be a pet, it can be anyone you want, but someone with whom you have an unequivocal, unqualified relationship of caring and love. And you then visualize this. And as you intensify that feeling and that emotion, and then your mother fades, and someone who is neutral, you visualize. And then you visualize the enemy, and you experience that same feeling towards the enemy. So this is a form of mind training. So by constantly repeating this process, the automatic reflexive response that rejects the enemy or the unpleasant, you begin to see that this is really very little to do with them, but with what you are able to do with your own mind. Now, this is not a snapshot. You do it once and then you're transformed. There's two sort of variations or two nuances to this. And, and the second is that, you normally we hear of how you visualize golden light coming into you. So you want to cleanse all your aches and pains and grief and suffering, and that it could come from a deity, it could come from the sun, and if you're depending on what tradition you are in, from your teacher, and they send out golden light, and you obey the golden light, and what all the negativity goes out as black smoke. And this is, people find it difficult to do, and it's not recommended unless you've done enough preliminary work, is that you really take in the black smoke of other people's pain and suffering into you, and it comes into your heart, and it bursts, or it crushes the sense of the self and goes back to them as golden healing light. So you quite literally, not just metaphorically, but experientially take on the suffering of another human being or an animal or all sentient beings. So what this does is that it softens the sense of the self, and it also changes your relationship with other people. So you start by taking on the suffering of those you love, then you start taking on the suffering of your enemies. And I do have to share that one of the things that I found that have lived with me in the 45 odd years that I've known His Holiness is that when I first went to Dharamsala, I was amazed that on the prayer mats of the monks, it said, "Pray for the Chinese." And this was a community that had just come out. It's like, the Jews saying, "Pray for the Nazis." And but there it was. And the prayer ceremony was really, "May the veils of delusion lift from the Chinese." That was the way they started their prayer. And so it was really saying that they're just deluded, which is why they're doing and doing what they are. And so it's a very fundamental practice, but certainly the one of taking in someone else's suffering is to be cautiously done, because it could harm one. There is a very important feature which I feel I should mention. I thought I wouldn't, because it's not something that I am myself on top of, but I think I'd be recalcitrant if I didn't flag, the fourth dimension, which is in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and the teachings of the Dalai Lama, is called Shunya. And Shunya is translated as, or mistranslated as emptiness, and misunderstood to be nothingness. So we don't normally get into a discussion about it, because for the reasons that I had mentioned, that these are difficult to explain, because there is no equivalent vocabulary for them. But I think that for you to be familiar with the idea, even in its gross explanation that someone like me can offer you, I think it's important to just briefly flag that. And at the simple level, it's quite easy to grasp, but experientially much more complicated. And many of you may have heard of the old illustration of a practitioner in the dark mistaking a rope for a snake. And when he mistakes the rope for a snake, his reality is that the rope is the snake. And that's it. And so he treats it as a snake. Now, what is it? Is it a rope or a snake? And who establishes what it is? And so what it really says is that all reality and everything is really dependent on the causes and conditions that in which they are perceived and in which they are experienced. So an easier example to understand, an imperfect one though, is say ice cream. And so ice cream is ice cream because it's made up of milk and cream and what have you. But the temperature at which those components come together is very decisive, because before it becomes ice cream, it is not ice cream, it is its component elements. And while it is at whatever, 0 degrees, say -2 to +2, it is ice cream. But the minute the temperature rises or drops, it stops being ice cream. So everything we see and we experience is what it is because of certain external and internal qualities and circumstances. So if we can deeply internalize that, then we know that everything that we're attached to is not solid and is dependent on external factors and its internal qualities. And so that too loosens and diminishes our attachment to it and to craving. And so what the Buddha really was saying was that we suffer because we crave a false reality and we crave a gratification that cannot fulfill. But if we begin to realize that what we crave is not only impermanent and is interdependent, but actually has no existence independent of these causes and conditions. So if we realize the fragility of ice cream, we either gobble it up really quickly or we rush and put it in the freezer in order to hold on to it. So that's the craving. How do you hold on to ice cream? So, I mean, a sort of very loose kind of analogy to what this idea is. And the great masters, I think across traditions, through practice, are able to see this. This is like the ultimate nature of reality. So we talk about two truths. So this is the absolute truth. But the relative truth is the ice cream is the ice cream and we can enjoy it. So is there any other question? No.
Thank you, sir, addressing the questions. Dr. Bijlani, I request you to share your view.
When a person of the stature of Rajiv Mehrotra has
Good
spoken,
God, please.
really,
भाई हैं, क्या बात कर रहे हैं? I'll have to object.
the best I can do is to point out some key take-home messages and certain things which struck me as truly valuable takeaways. One of the things that emerged was that while in the Indian tradition, which we may call the Sanatana Dharma tradition or the Vedantic tradition, we have had the freedom to go on our own personal spiritual quest. If we are not convinced with what other rishis and seers have experienced and tried to express in words, we can go on our own personal quest. But then sometimes the assumption is that if we also discover the same absolute reality, our experience will be very similar to theirs. But it need not be. That is what the mother has pointed out with great it's a great perception, that if the infinite is capable of infinite forms, why should we express that infinite will reveal itself in exactly the same way to everyone to whom it reveals because of the sadhana, because the person has put in the necessary amount of concentration and self-purification. These are the two basic ingredients which all seers and mystics have followed: intense concentration and extreme degrees of self-purification. So the divine does reveal as a result of this type of persistent practice. But then the divine doesn't have to reveal itself in exactly the same way to everyone. And that is what explains the range of experiences which the different seers had, the experience that the Buddha had and the experience which His Holiness the Dalai Lama had at Ajmer. Now, these experiences can come in infinite ways, but so long as we can get some glimpse of the absolute reality from these experiences, that is fine. And why that experience of the absolute reality is important from the practical point of view in terms to practical application is that while it does not eliminate the physical and physiological aspects of pain, it does not even eliminate the reasons for which that type of pain comes, whether it's physical or emotional. Those types of ups and downs in life also continue to be there. But when we see those fluctuations in light of the absolute reality, we are able to accept. So acceptance is what that leads to, and that leads in turn to equanimity, which is in fact the best that we can arrive at, the closest that we can get to what we normally call happiness. But happiness is a part of dualities. It comes coupled with sorrow, and therefore what we sometimes aim at is not that freedom from that duality, but in fact a steady peace. And that comes from that equanimity rather than from a thrilling experience or the disappearance of pain or the reasons for which that pain is experienced. They continue to be there, and yet we are able to meet. And this freedom which the tradition has had is what was emphasized also by the Buddha, as we heard that when he was leaving the body and the disciples insisted on learning something more, he said that, well, you have my teachings available, but what is more important is that you can go on your own quest, experience, use your mind and see what appears logical, couple it with your experience and arrive at your own insights. So this freedom to arrive at our own insights has always been available. Now, however, while that freedom has been available, to use that freedom is not easy. And that is how we resort to faith, because faith is faith till knowledge has been experienced. And since experience does not come to most of us, at least not easily, and it's not an instant gratification, it can't be a one-time event. Till then, that faith is what helps us, because without that faith, that experience will not in fact come, because then the mind will intervene and will keep in fact obstructing that type of an experience. Another important thing that I feel one can repeat is that we never in fact stop learning, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama in fact continues his practice, as well as acknowledges, even if it is out of his humility, that he continues to learn from people half his age. And that is a great lesson in humility, as well as that endless learning that goes on throughout life. Then, this meditative practice of praying for everyone, including our enemies, and even going to the extent of taking on the suffering of the enemies, processing it and returning it after transforming it into a golden light, healing light, is again something which is very revealing. Rajiv Bhai has been an intellectual, as you can make out from his background, and even from what he has spoken today, you can see he is extremely sort of sharp intellect. And for an intellect to be a devotee is not easy. So in that sense, he has accomplished something really remarkable, because the intellect has a way of continuing to raise questions and doubts, which cannot be resolved at the intellectual level, but need a perception at a level higher than that. So I'm sure that also he has very well developed that sense which goes beyond reason, and that is how it has been possible for him to become a devotee. And to become a devotee and a disciple, and he has explained how he has been a disciple of so many and sees no inconsistency in that. In fact, Sri Ramakrishna was in a way a pioneer in that inclusivity, as he pointed out, and that why he has been able to do it is, I was just thinking, Sri Aurobindo said that we basically get three things from the Guru. One is the word. And when it comes to the word, an intellectual like Rajiv Bhai can produce enough of words of the best quality on his own. He doesn't need a Guru for that. Then the second thing that the Guru can give is an example. Now that does help. And I'm sure he has looked at the examples that his Gurus have set. But most important, Sri Aurobindo says, in fact, uh, the most important thing that the Guru does for the disciple is to be an influence, just the presence. And I'm sure it is that presence, the uh, peace that he has felt in the presence of the Guru and or the Gurus that he has got drawn to, that has helped him uh, suspend for a time the intellect, realizing its limitations, and rise to that level which has given him a glimpse of that higher reality, which the gurus have been a channel for communicating to him. So it is the guru's influence that has been perhaps the most important reason why a person of his intellectual caliber has also been able to turn into a devotee. I'm sorry, I mean, I ended up analyzing him, which is not really, which is going beyond my brief, but somehow I felt like sharing this as I was listening, that how a person like him could have turned to these holy men and treated them as their gurus, and how that could have helped him. Because the guru is ultimately an influence who is only channelizing the influence of the divine. The guru is a channel, the guru is a bridge. And that is easy to relate to, because to relate to an nameless, amorphous, absolute reality is not easy. And therefore, when it takes on a human form, and when it can see the divine in that human, and that divine human being has a level of consciousness which allows the force of the divine to flow to the disciples without any obstruction, then receptive people like Rajiv Bhai can make the most of it. So I think that is the type of process that he has been experiencing, which has been uh, important in his life. And then he has not stopped there. He has been sharing it with others, because that is what spirituality is about. Lord Buddha didn't stop at his own enlightenment. He returned to share it with the world. And that is what Sri Aurobindo and the mother also emphasized, that spirituality is not for our personal salvation, but in fact, the most important thing that any one of us can do, even with all our limitations, is to develop that sense of oneness with the rest, and express that oneness by giving what we have to those who need it. And those who can't give on their own, they don't have that spiritual capacity, they can further in turn act as the channels of the Guru. The Guru acts as the channel of the divine, and then the disciple can act as a channel for the Guru. But then one flame can continue to light other flames. And that is how one can sort of justify one's existence, fulfill the purpose of one's life, become happier, experience the type of joy that is independent of external circumstances, and also make the world a better place to live in. So that is the type of engagement that Rajiv Bhai has had for many decades with his gurus and the world.
Ramesh Bhai, my God, you're a dangerous man. This makes me so vulnerable to ego, if I believe the word that you said. But I appreciate everything that you said. But alas, I wish that were true. You haven't seen my moments of panic and despair and upset. And but thank you very much, Ramesh Bhai, and the Aurobindo Society. And I only want to say, you don't need any other speakers. You have Ramesh Bhai here. Just put him on every week, and we will all learn so much from him. And I really celebrate the fact that he has and all of you have brought together such an amazing sangha. And what can I do? I'll just sort of send you my prayers and the intention behind the prayers. We're not, I think Ramesh Bhai mentioned faith. And I think that what the Dalai Lama would say is that each one of us needs, as I said, a particular mental diet, and we need faith, and so we need faith. It doesn't make it superior or inferior or better or worse. And I'm really grateful for this inclusive space, and my prayers are with you. And I hope that I will continue to interact with you and learn from you.
I'm glad you repeated that we all need a different type of diet, mental diet, spiritual diet. So we all have our individual requirements. And that's again the type of freedom that Sri Aurobindo's yoga has, that you can carve out your own path depending upon your inclinations, temperament, and circumstances. And not only that, that also justifies why we have to have speakers like you. I can't be enough. We need a variety because different speakers would satisfy different types of mental diet, even in our group, even in those who attend these talks and will watch them on the YouTube. So we do need that variety. We all bring in certain type of freshness, and it's the way it is put, and the approach of each one of us can be a little different, and that can satisfy different types of appetite for this spiritual diet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bishani. We thank you again, Rajiv sir, for sharing your time with us and for such a valuable and helpful session for all of us. I thank the participants for being with us today. We can close today's session with a moment of peaceful silence. Thank you.